listening to The Donor Doctor Show, where your host James Newberry will help you improve the health of your fundraising. Now over to James.
Hello, this is The Donor Doctor again. I'm here with my friend Stuart McLean of McLean and Newberry Direct. Welcome back, Stuart.
Well, welcome back, James.
Hey, we're going to talk about three things today: empathy, discernment, and patience. I'm going to tie them all together. But first, I'd like to read from Dostoevsky, one of my favorite writers. While nothing is easier than to denounce the evildoer, nothing is more difficult than to understand him. And I want to give you a story here. I was listening to the radio the other day. The DJ's Donnie Simpson. Are you familiar with him? He's a local DJ. I think he may be national, too.
No, I don't. I'm not familiar with him.
Anyway, he was talking about the late Marion Barry, and he was a fan of Marion Barry. And he said, white people, they don't get Marion Barry at all. I know you remember for younger people, Marion Barry was the mayor of D.C. for a long time, and he's most famous for the bitch set me up. He was into cocaine or crack or something like that. Or he had a number of scandals, as I recall. And Donnie Simpson said, well, he gave me my first job. And then afterwards, I saw a speech, and he was quite good in that speech. And Donnie Simpson was talking about his charisma and how everybody liked him. So it was a totally different perspective than most people. And I'm not endorsing Marion Barry. I don't think he was a good mayor. But I could see that, I'm not wearing the shoes. And that's what empathy is, where you kind of put yourself in somebody else's shoes. I got this from Helen Reese of a TED Talk. Every human being wants to be seen and understood. Posture is important. Doctors who sit at bedside are better liked and seem more caring, for example. Our survival depends on empathy. Signs of tainted food might be an example of that, or a predator, you fear in somebody's face. Now, interestingly, one of our colleagues, Dan Gray, he considered empathy the number one quality of a copywriter. Does that surprise you at all?
Well, I've always, if I didn't use the word empathy, I've always looked for a way to make an emotional connection. Mm-hmm. I've always found that the best envelope teasers, for example, were ones that would try to make an emotional connection. There's one that I know you liked from years past that I did, Mail Call Hurts.
Oh, that's a great teaser. Yeah, love it.
3 words, Mail Call Hurts. And, of course, it's about sending care packages to the troops. And if you don't get one and everybody else gets letters from home, you're away from home anyway, and it just adds to your loneliness. So if you can build that empathy or that emotional connection right from the get-go and use that to pull people in, I think you're halfway home.
It's interesting. They talk about whether empathy is something you either have or don't, whether you're born with it. And the consensus is actually that it can be developed. And one of the ways you develop it is by hearing or experiencing the stories of other people. For example, before I listened to Donnie Simpson, it really had never occurred to me that there might be a different perspective on Marion Barry. I just thought, well, they're just crazy. Although I had heard his speech, so I knew that he had a gift, and I knew he had a charisma, so I got that part. But just hearing how he had a different opinion than most other people I know, it's fascinating. And of course, I had another experience like this in the Holy Land. My son was a transfer student in Jordan. So we go visit Jordan, and my dad and I went there, and the travel agent made a mistake of putting us back into Israel on a Saturday, which is their Sabbath. And it was just brutal. We spent over 4 hours in the line, and they were kind of rough. They treated us like the Palestinians. So there was a certain empathy. Now, before then, I'd heard the story of my son had met some Palestinians, and they often have like this big gold key everywhere. And I said, well, what does that mean? And that represents those that had left and the keys to their home, their farms or something. And they, of course, long for that. Now, I'm not endorsing their position versus the Israelis. I'm not getting into that. But I'm saying you can kind of sympathize when you hear the story. And then when you experience it, you more empathize. You're wearing the same shoes. Now, we eventually got in there and we were treated well within Israel. But it just, it was just brutal. and you see little slights when you're a second-class citizen, you could see why they would feel that way. I'm not getting into the politics of that situation. I'm just saying I could see it, and that's what you want to do. Even if you don't endorse it, you can kind of see it. That's an important thing, and it's also important you understand your client's story. And I can think of a couple times where it didn't happen. For example, there was a museum, and it had Senator Inouye on their board. And you know Senator Inouye, he was a Medal of Honor recipient. He's also Japanese American.
Mm-hmm. Hawaii.
Yeah, and the author of the thing said something like, history books spend more time talking about the Japanese internment than they do about, I don't know, Pearl Harbor or some other battle. I forget what it was. And it may have been true about a particular history book, but they got so upset because that's their story. You know, if you're Japanese American, that was like the worst thing that ever happened to you. It's sort of like, to diminish the Holocaust would be for somebody Jewish. You just don't do that. And they were understandably upset, and I was surprised that the copywriter wasn't told this or, whatever, but maybe it's a lack of a big part of empathy is just knowing somebody's story, knowing why they think differently than you, or knowing what are their hot buttons, what they care about, their sensitivities. And sometimes it's more subtle. I was at a speech class not too long ago, and somebody was really talented. I think he's going to run for office. But he said in their speech, Birth of a Nation. You remember there was a movie, A Birth of a Nation, very racist, but one of the top, like a lot of innovations in cinemas, D.W. Griffiths. And the black fellow in the class says, I wouldn't use that term. You know what I'm saying? He could have used some other term, and there's other examples, like George W. Bush used the term crusade. There's nothing, you and I use crusade all the time in English. It doesn't necessarily mean like going back to the Middle Ages, but it could be misinterpreted that way.
Well, Billy Graham had his crusades.
No, I understand. I don't think there's anything wrong with a crusade, but words can be misused. George H.W. Bush, you remember the term New World Order when he was using that? Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, I wouldn't use that because among a certain people, they see that as like, I don't know, the UN taking over or satanic, or you know what I'm saying? I just he stopped using that term actually after a while. But from a marketing perspective, new is always good. But had he known, had advisors, that's part of his base, he probably wouldn't have used that term. I'm just saying that words have power, and you have to think about how somebody else might interpret them differently than you intend. That's all I'm saying. Now, you usually are more empathetic towards things that you've experienced. But sometimes that's not true, and that's called an empathy gap. Have you ever heard of that?
I've never heard it put that way, but I've heard it put, it's that you have trouble identifying with somebody and their situation, relating to it.
I'm talking about actually somebody who's gone through the same experience, and they're less sympathetic than an ordinary person. And if there was an earlier podcast I did about begging, and a guy who was really down on his luck, and there was somebody else in West Virginia just really bothered him because he was in the similar straits, yet he pulled himself out, and he was really hostile to this. So that's kind of like an empathy gap. So it's not like 100% that if you've walked in somebody's shoes that you're going to be more sympathetic to them or empathetic to them, but they're correlated for sure. Now, one last thing I wanted to mention about this, you think of history, well, an understanding of history would be helpful in empathy. But sometimes it actually keeps divisions alive. And I recall reading in a paper one time about some dispute in Northern Ireland that happened in like 1602. And people were still protesting it. So it's not 100%. So in general, it does help to know somebody's story, to know history, maybe a group story. But it's not a sure thing, Just like in walking in somebody's shoe, maybe you're more hostile. So it's an interesting thing. Let's talk about discernment, and there's a lot of in the Bible they talk about it like the gift of discernment as a spiritual gift. Although I would say that a lot of people that are church people don't have discernment too. It's a quality that's that's lacking. Particularly, I do think it's something you get more of when you get older. Don't you think it's age correlated?
Oh, I think it can be, as long as you're a person who has a certain level of self-awareness. And some people don't have much, but to me, discernment in marketing comes up, for instance, when you realize that if you try to do cookie-cutter marketing, well, this technique worked for this client, so now I'm going to try it for that one. It may not be an appropriate thing for that client's image or their audience to try to do what you did for somebody else. And I'll give you an example. In political fundraising, it's common to put, for instance, a dollar bill showing through an envelope.
Right.
And I had someone. I didn't think it would be appropriate for a presidential library, but I had somebody higher ranking me in the agency kept saying, "Have you done a dollar bill appeal? Have you done a dollar bill appeal?" Well, I didn't do one because I didn't think it was appropriate for that organization. It was, if it was had to do with that president on the dollar bill, and you wanted to make a point,
right,
maybe
George
it would
Washington.
have been,
Sure.
maybe it would have been fine.
Right.
But I just didn't think that it fit.
And
this
you
client.
were right. There was blowback, and
there was terrible blowback by it, and
that's one of the first things you do. You don't want to embarrass your client, the people you're working with. They don't want to hear grief from the board, and you have to consider that.
No, but what are you going to do when you're
right? Let me give you an example of where I think a group lacked discernment, and somebody proposed, and they actually did mail a package that recommended that teachers be armed. In other words, it would train teachers to be armed. This is in response to Sandy Hook, I think, happened in Connecticut. And needless to say, the mailing didn't work. Now, I don't think that's good public policy, but even if it was, you should know enough about marketing to know that's not going to work, why that's not an attractive enough offer. But the person said something, and I had been impressed with this person, although I was less impressed after he said this. He said, well, it probably didn't happen anyway, or it probably didn't work because people didn't believe the story. And he was referring to the story by Alex Jones that Sandy Hook was some conspiracy made up. And I said, what do you mean? Because I had not heard of this. I don't listen to Alex Jones.
Oh, that's just kookiness.
Yeah, it's just kookiness. And I said, well, what do you mean it didn't happen? I mean, if you believe that's a conspiracy, then everybody has to be in on it. I mean, including the NRA, because the NRA would love to show that didn't happen, that they're manufacturing evidence of tragedies like this. It's just absolute craziness. And I said, well, surely you don't believe that. And he says, well, I don't know. I said, well, I don't know. It's not sufficient. You should know. This happened. I'm not saying that people, the media is not biased here and there, or often even, but they're not making up stories out of thin air like that, and that to me is discernment,
I think as marketers, whether we're selling a product or service, or we're raising money for a museum or some cause, or health issues and things, I think there can be a fine line. I've seen some of these hospitals for children on television, and I remember years ago one of my colleagues was meeting with a particular children's hospital and wanted to get some stories so that they can of some of their patients so that they can use it in the direct mail, for empathy.
Sure.
and credibility. And one of the physicians there looked at my colleague and said, "We don't exploit our children here." And my colleague he didn't show it in the meeting, but he was just furious with the condescension of this doctor. And when I see a particular thing on TV right now. They have a very happy young child who's disabled on television, and he's your narrator, and you see him, and he's showing you the other kids that are helped.
Well, that's the difference between success and failure.
And I know it's working because they keep coming up with new commercials.
You talking about the Shriners Hospital or St.
I think it was St. Joseph's or whatever they call it.
The one in Memphis. The
really fine stuff, and very heartwarming, and they're showing success, and I think they've done it in a way that doesn't exploit the children.
Oh, I agree with you. You can always use somebody's name or change the name or something like that. Well, I do have some advice on discernment. I think it's helpful to hear different sources. I've certainly recommended this before in the podcast. Just don't watch Fox News all the day. Switch to CNN here or there, or BBC or whatever it is. But I do think you want to keep yourself away from crazy voices like this Alex Jones. And I had an experience like this. Many years ago, I would play cards late on like Friday night, and I would be tired. I'd have to drive like 40 minutes home. And I used to listen to this guy named Art Bell. Are you familiar with him? Well, he was a guy out of Vegas, and he had just the weirdest things. He was believing in conspiracy theories, UFOs. I mean, just a lot of weird stuff. And back then, the big fear was Y2K, and everybody was talking about Y2K. And of course, nothing happened with Y2K, so he lost his credibility with me. But it made me afraid until I talked to a friend of mine who was a programmer. He says, don't worry about it. You're going to be fine. But, it's like this. And at first, it was entertaining. It kept me awake. But I thought the kookiness is just not helpful. So there's certain people that are manipulating. And I think Alex Jones is one of those. I did read that even his lawyers said that in a dispute. But anybody who says that, 9/11 was an inside job, I don't know if he said that, but I've heard that from others. A lot of these conspiracy theories are just total nonsense. I mean, some of them, JFK, that there was multiple shooters, and that's more believable. So, I'm not saying conspiracies there's never any truth to them, but the Sandy Hook was just so crazy that the fact that somebody would say, I don't know, shows that they're too, that maybe they need to reevaluate their thinking process of how likely that is. I think it's always, a discernment's a good thing to know if you're dealing with a crook, or a crazy person, you know what I'm saying? It's whether somebody has good character. I mean, that's a good, valuable thing for discernment. But discernment is also needed in marketing, and I think about when experts tell you conflicting things. I'll give you an example. Richard Armstrong came on the show. He's probably the most famous copywriter who's been on the show. And he said, we is a terrible word. And I suspect you'd agree with that, right?
Yes, we would.
Okay. Although I went to the speech class, John Shosky was a speechwriter for Reagan and the elder Bush. And he said, we is a good word because it connects you with an audience. And he gave an example. You remember Ross Perot gave the speech before the NAACP, and he said, you people. I mean, how more off-putting is that to say you people? So who's right? You know what I'm saying? It's like you're hearing conflicting advice, and that's where discernment comes in.
Well, I think Mr. Armstrong is probably thinking that it's better to say you and I.
Correct, although he says a lot of I when telling a story too, though.
Yes. Sometimes, though, you're going to have to use the we.
I agree. Now, the elder Bush, he liked to use we frequently as a sign of humility. Like he wasn't. He was a president as the Cold War was winding down, and he didn't want to seem like America. He didn't want to gloat about winning it, and he would use that as an act of humility. So I'm just saying, different people see the same word and will give you the opposite advice. Gary Halbert, he would tended to go with more personal, no teaser approach. Denny Hatch had more of a pro teaser. So that's a frequent, to tease or not to tease is a frequent question people ask.
Well, you tease if you have a good teaser or a good offer. one that can be comprehended quickly and make an emotional connection, preferably. But if you don't, then don't tease.
Well, I agree with it. I'm just giving you an example of where discernment is important. Well, let's talk about patience, because patience is also very important. A farmer has patience. They know they plant the seed and they don't expect anything to happen for a few months. When somebody builds a home, same thing. You got to get the zoning permits and you have to, lay the foundation and then start. But for whatever reason, a lot of charities do not have that same patience. And I don't know if you saw the TED Talk by Dan Pallotta, but he did a lot of event fundraising. He was very successful in these AIDS rides and breast cancer. But the first year you would do an event in an area, you might not make a lot of money. You might make only, say, 20% or whatever it was. But that would have grown over time. But for whatever, he maybe had enemies. I don't know what it was. But some media came after him, and they weren't patient. They didn't understand. They didn't compare. They were comparing them to more established charities. They'd been maybe running events for a long time. It was an unfair comparison. And he had been wildly successful, or had the potential to be, but they kind of ran him out of business. And that's an example. Dr. Dresner, I had him on as a guest a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about like high dollar fundraising. You don't always get it. You may make the contact, you cultivate the relationship, but you may not get the big gift for a few years, maybe in a will, for example, or maybe when they have more funds. So you have to be patient about that, and you have to kind of understand, just like a farmer wouldn't expect that the corn to grow in a week, you can't expect your high dollar giving or your direct mail program to be making you huge sums the first month or two, the first year even. It takes a little patience. And I've noticed it, even the National Lost Museum, which largely built on direct mail. First year I went down there, they were not as friendly as they were when the grand opening, because it takes patience, it takes faith that all the work is going to pay off, and a lot of times people don't have it right away. It's harder.
Well, one of the things I like about direct mail fundraising, for example, is that clients can see to the penny.
Right. The result.
How it's doing. And I try to point out results to them that, only the direct mail is only half of it. It's where you pick up and leverage the power of your list and start having special events and wills and bequest opportunities and visits to people and phone calls. And you don't always ask for money either. So there needs to be patience there. And some groups would rather just complain than do the work. I had one group in particular. I said, we did everything for these people. We even identified who they were as far as that they were in the top 5% of the assets in the United States. Mm-hmm. We emailed them that information from the database. We emailed them their phone number, their address. And when we finally went out and talked to them about it, we said, how's that working out for you? They said, we can't do it because we have too many $1,000 plus donors.
That's crazy.
That was their complaint.
I interviewed Ron Robinson of Young America's Foundation, who's been very successful in upgrading donors, most of whom he's reached through direct mail, actually. And he showed me, I wish you'd have shown me before the interview, but he had a group, showed me page after page of people who started off giving like $50 or $100, and then after they were contacted, they were giving like $5,000 or $10,000. And it was many, had done this, and the giving history was quite interesting. So you're not going to get the big gift usually through the mail. There are some exceptions, but it's through those relationships. It gives you an entry. It's a good way to reach them initially.
I remember a group I was consulting for years ago, and the direct mail agency was concerned about this new consultant coming in for high dollar fundraising that had been brought in by his client, because he didn't do high dollar fundraising, and the high dollar guy was poo-pooing direct mail. which is what this organization lived off of. Anyway, the first thing this new high-dollar consultant came in who poo-pooed direct mail, he said, okay, now give me a list of all your $500 plus donors. Well, where does that consultant think those names came from? They came from the direct mail.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It is crazy.
Yeah, he has to have a source. Unless you have a natural constituency, like a college.
Right.
You need either events or direct mail to come up with the names, right? I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah. So, yeah, it doesn't make sense. A lot of people, I guess they're elitist. Maybe he thinks he's too good for it. Who knows?
Could be. I do know that some people look down on direct mail. I think if done well, and it can really help do a lot of good for an organization and the charity that you're trying.
Well, the advertising. If you're a museum, for example, I mean, you're going to get a lot of people come to your museum because they heard about it and they read your story. It's free advertising.
Oh, absolutely. I remember one presidential museum that I worked on. I came up with the idea of sending people an upfront premium pass for a family of 4 to get into the museum for free. And the client didn't shoot down the idea. The client said, you know what? He said, if it gets them here, that's a good thing, because I know that per person they're spending $35 in the gift shop, because we've done the research. And this is 20 years ago, so it must be 50 or 60 now.
Right.
But he said, you know, if it gets them here and they weren't going to be here before, we weren't really losing out on the admissions anyway.
Right.
But once they're here, it was free advertising. It drove them there, and they're going to spend money anyway.
Well, excellent, Stuart. Appreciate you coming on as a guest. This is the Donor Doctor signing out. Till next time. Bye.